each internet radio platform.
Well, greetings. This is Charles Lincoln again, and this is Speak Free Radio, presenting Legal Realism, episode 28. Once again, I'm alone tonight, so I'm going to be talking pretty much about my favorite things in history. I have quite a few favorite things in history, and tonight, we've got a good collection of them. History is the crucible in which law is formed. If we don't understand the history which created laws, we have no hope of understanding law at all. Law is the result of social process. The creation of law is the political process, and the modification and implementation of law is also a political act and series of political facts. And this is what I want people to understand about law more than anything else, really, is that law is in no sense, at least human law, is in no sense a series of absolutes. I realize that there are a great many people who believe in God's law, and I certainly grew up within a religious background where I was taught God's law, but I don't see it being applied in the human world at all, any more than human law. And of course, there's a tremendous debate in philosophy about natural law and whether anything, including the laws of thermodynamics in nature, is actually law. But regardless, we can certainly see the operation of nature in and its conflict with human behavior in the creation of the law. Another fact about law, I just said that there are no facts in law, but another fact about law is that law is shaped by human language. Law is entirely about human language, and human language is shaped by storytelling and mythology. That is the biggest reality of all, is that every day in court, every day negotiating a contract, every day is about storytelling. And I think that part of the problem that we have in Western civilization right now is that we who are traditional devotees of Western civilization have lost our narrative. We have lost the story that we want to tell. 120 years ago, before World War I, it seemed so much clearer that the whole world was evolving towards us, and that we were the supreme apogee of human achievement and civilization. That was the Victorian and Edwardian age. it started falling apart the day World War I began, probably the day of Archduke Ferdinand's assassination in Sarajevo. And some would say it began even before that, but there's this interesting period of the late 19th century where Great Britain and France and Germany achieve a sum total of magnificent imperial achievement in Europe, and yet arguably the big cracks in the West had already inflicted the United States of America. The war of 1861 to 65, that was such a huge part of my background as a Southern American, that was the that was the beginning of the end of Western civilization in so many ways. What the North did to the South, what the 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, did to his cousins, including my ancestors in the South, was the beginning of the end. And that in itself was inspired by a series of events that ultimately go back to, February 1848 is always an important date that I cite, because that's the date that Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto was published. But before that, the Marxist revolutions of 1848 that shook Europe to the core could not have happened without the French Revolution 50, 60 years before, starting in 1789, the fall of the Bastille and the execution of the King and Queen of France and thousands of others. And oddly enough, the revolution in France could not have happened, probably would not have happened, at least not in the same way, without the revolution in the United States. And so the first historical event I want to talk about today is Valley Forge and the American crisis. Today was in 1776, Tom Paine published his American Crisis, beginning with the famous phrase, "These are the times that try men's souls." The Summer Soldier and the Sunshine Patriot. Those were extraordinary lines written by a forerunner of the French Revolution in America. Tom Paine was one of the most liberal of the founding fathers. He never actually held anything by way of a major position in the United States, but he was a pamphleteer who had, between the American crisis and common sense, he had a tremendous impact in 1776, and he had a tremendous impact in promoting the French Revolution as well. And so we also need to think about what happened in the war. On this day, in 1777, the year after the Declaration of Independence, during the American Revolution, General George Washington led 11,000 regulars to take up their winter headquarters at Valley Forge on the west bank of the Schuylkill, I don't know how to pronounce it, Schuylkill River. Somebody fix me on that. I've never been there, obviously. Schuyll River, 22 miles, 35 kilometers north of Philadelphia, northwest of Philadelphia. So the American Revolution was formed by the inflammatory words of people like Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death," Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, among these life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I don't have Sam Dixon online today, but I know that he thinks that that was the beginning of the end of Western civilization. Those words, Tom Paine, of course, in Common Sense in the American Crisis. Those are the words that inspired people to fight. Without the fighting, there never would have been an American nation. There never would have been an American Constitution. We probably would have stayed part of the British Empire, which, in my opinion, and as I understand it anyhow, in Sam Dixon's opinion, would not have been such a terrible thing. If King George had done what France later did, what Britain sort of did way too late, and simply allow representation. The French and the Dutch, for instance, they still have their overseas departments, and the current French and Dutch former colonies are fully voting members of the French and Dutch legislatures. The representatives of Curaçao and Bonaire, Aruba on the north coast of South America, all have their representatives in the Dutch Parliament, and the representatives of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and several other French possessions have their representatives in Paris. And if Britain had had the sense to seat white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Englishmen born in Virginia and Massachusetts and South Carolina in the British Parliament in 1765, possibly as early as 1765, right after the French and Indian War, that the latest 1775, somewhere in that 10-year period. That's by that simple expedient of sitting colonials in the British Parliament, they would have saved the North American Empire and preserved, made Great Britain an even greater empire than it became by the late 19th century. And that, of course, would have saved us from the horrors of the American Civil War. The horrors of the American Civil War that ultimately led to the collapse of everything, which is what we're in right now. In my humble opinion, we are in the collapse of everything right now. I talked to a friend of mine here in New Orleans who might be listening tonight again. He's a fairly regular listener here, and he told me that he expects a 200-year war in Europe. None of us will survive that war. I've already lived past my own personal life expectancy. I keep surprising people, I guess, but none of us will live 200 years to see if there's really a 200-year war in Europe or not. And if there is, in answer to Nellie and the other people in Missouri who were asking if they should move to Europe, I'm guessing probably not. I just don't have a lot of optimism. Oh, I did hear, I don't know if it was in the New Yorker or in the New York Times today, that France, which certainly used to be one of the most delightful places to live in Europe, in the 1920s, lots of Americans moved to Paris after World War I, and throughout the 20th century, Lots of people moved to the south of France to live on the Riviera. It's a great place to live if you got some money, especially around Monaco and Nice and Cannes. But France and the French language, the beautiful, exquisite French language, is suffering a transformation. And you'll have to look this up. I can't remember if it was in the New York Times or in the New Yorker, but in one of those sources it said modern French language is changing. 60% of the people who speak French today live in sub-Saharan Africa. They are changing the unified French language, the standardized French language that the French have been so proud of during the late 19th and throughout the 20th century. French is becoming Africanized, just as France itself is becoming Africanized and dominated by Muslims. And Marion Maréchal, one of my favorite French politicians, granddaughter of Jean-Marie Le Pen, she, in her newsletter today, she was saying that 70% of French Muslims endorse the Hamas attack in October and support a continuation of the war in Israel. And so we know that that is basically up to some level practice for perpetual war throughout the world. But if you think about the French language becoming Africanized, have a look at Haiti. It is not going to be a happy ending. If France is Islamicized and Africanized, and the French language is Africanized, and I guess what did you say, Arabicized by loan words and grammatical changes coming in from Arabic and African languages, that's the end of France. It will no longer be France in any sense of the word. But let's go back to the history of this date. So 1776, we had on December, The American Crisis by Tom Paine. The following year, we had the beginning of Valley Forge, which ultimately led to Washington crossing the Delaware, a famous scene. And all of that is the mythology that underlies our warfare, the mythological warfare of the American Revolution that was possibly a major mistake from the standpoint of European history. It would have been much happier if we had stayed part of the British Empire. It would have been much more fortuitous for the unity of the Anglo-Saxon people, for the unity of the white race, dare I say. And oddly enough, it probably would have hastened the peaceful end of the slave trade and of slavery in the United States without the terrible dislocations that happened. But let's get back to the nuts and bolts of what actually did happen in American history on December 19th. First, I love going back further. I mean, in 1154, Henry II of England, father of King John and Richard the Lionhearted, was crowned King of England. His wife, Eleanor of Aquitaine, that was the height of the Plantagenet dynasty. Another one of my favorite sidelines in life was my interest in Mexican archaeology, my interest in archaeology general, but especially Mexican archaeology. I spent a lot of time in Mexico studying the Aztec and the Maya, mostly the Maya of Chichen Itza, subject of my doctoral dissertation at Harvard. But in 1487, opening ceremony of the great Templo Mayor of Tenochtitlan, modern Mexico City, at least 4,000 prisoners of war were sacrificed to the Aztec gods over 4 days. 4,000 walked up stone temples and their hearts excised. Try to picture that if you can stand it for a few minutes. I always have a little bit of trouble with imagining what it's like to excise one person's heart, much less 4,000. But that was in 1487, which was what, 34 years before the final Spanish conquest in 1521 that we were talking about, leading to the Virgin of Guadalupe last week. Final conquest of Mexico City, surrender at Tlatelolco, final Aztec resistance was 1521. Virgin of Guadalupe appeared 10 years later. All of this, a mere 32 years. There was certainly plenty of people who remembered the slaughter of 4,000 prisoners in 1487. In any event, also relating to Native Americans, in 1675, King Philip's War combined colonial militias in Massachusetts staged massive attack against Great Swamp Fort owned by the Narragansett Indians, totally destroying the settlement and killing or displacing hundreds of non-combatant Indian women and children. There's a lot of controversy, of course, about the American conquest of the Indians, and the people of Massachusetts tend to be particularly sanctimonious about it. But 1675 on this date, King Philip's War, December 19th, major white Anglo-Saxon Puritan victory over the Narragansett Indians. In the realm of mythology, 1686, Robinson Crusoe left his island after 28 years, according to Daniel Defoe's novel, Robinson Crusoe. These are good things to remember. Right after the American Revolution, William Pitt became the youngest prime minister in British history at age 24. And then, now this is kind of interesting, in 1795, the very first state appropriation of money for road building in the United States took place in Kentucky. And in 1823, Georgia passed the first U.S. state birth registration law in the U.S. That is interesting because that shows that as early as 1823, the secular power of the individual states over the regulation of what had been the family entirely in the hands of the church was beginning to be transformed. I think I've mentioned before that my theory of the First Amendment to the Constitution, the Establishment Clause, is that the Establishment Clause was basically to say that there could be no such thing as federal regulation of the family. There is, of course, now tremendous federal regulation of the family. In fact, the laws of states, such as Georgia, relating to birth registration, marriage, education, everything else that used to be covered in the established Church of England by the 7 sacraments, has been entirely reduced to state control now, and the state control has been entirely reduced to federal control. So it's very interesting to think about 1823, exactly 200 years ago today, the first state birth registration law, the first state-issued birth certificates, replacing basically baptismal certificates, as a means of establishing identity. That is 200 years old today, and that is a very significant transformation in the intrusion of state power into what used to be entirely a religious matter, and I believe should have stayed out of state hands. But also in the Deep South, 5 years after that, we have John Caldwell Calhoun's 1828 report to the South Carolina legislature defending the rights of states to nullify federal laws. Remember, we were talking the other day, I forget when it was, we did have occasion to mention that 30 years before 1828, which is to say in 1798, Virginia and Kentucky passed, at the behest of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, Virginia and Kentucky passed acts of nullification of the Alien and Sedition Acts. Those nullifications were never, ever challenged judicially, which is really interesting if you think about it. These days they would be, and the federal courts would probably have overturned the Virginia and Kentucky acts of nullification of the Alien and Sedition Acts. But John Caldwell Calhoun had dedicated his life to states' rights, and in particular to the concept of nullification. And there is a group called the 10th Amendment Society that I support, I'm a member of, and I encourage everyone in the audience to at least consider looking at their website, 10th Amendment Society. It's actually based in Los Angeles, all the kind of ironic, California being the most liberal of all states, but also a state very interested in nullifying certain federal laws, such as federal laws against drug, the continuing illegal status of marijuana, for example, in federal law. But, about 10, 15 years ago, a good friend of mine, Kathy Lawson, and I attended, I believe, the first national meeting of the 10th Amendment Society in Atlanta, Georgia. And that was a very interesting and exciting moment. And of course, John Caldwell Calhoun was absolutely the hero of nullification and the hero of states' rights. Sam Dixon, my frequent co-host on this podcast, believes that nullification and states' rights are pointless. He believes that the entire Constitution, in fact, is pointless. I worry about that position. And oh my God, we just got an interesting blip from the New York Times. Oh heavens, this is going to be interesting. Colorado, according to the New York Times and Washington Post, the Colorado Supreme Court has held, this is huge, folks. Colorado Supreme Court has held that Donald Trump is ineligible to hold office again under the 14th Amendment. Of course, this is a state Supreme Court entering a ruling about a purely federal question. I don't know. I wonder how that will turn out. Speaking of the litigation of major state intrusions into federal law, that is just breathtaking. Donald Trump is ineligible to hold office again. The Colorado Supreme Court ruled, disqualifying him from the state's primary ballot. I'm going to read this because this is of such great moment. In the first court to find that the disqualification clause of the 14th Amendment applies to Mr. Trump, in addition to affirming that he engaged in insurrection. I was not in Washington on January 6th, but I did follow it with a great deal of interest, even though it completely interrupted and disturbed the celebration of the Feast of the Epiphany and the Joan of Arc parade here in New Orleans. But Joan of Arc is usually the first parade we have in the Mardi Gras season, starting on the Feast of the Epiphany. Former President Donald J. Trump is ineligible to hold office again. The Colorado Supreme Court ruled on Tuesday, accepting the argument that the 14th Amendment disqualifies him in an explosive decision that could upend the 2024 election. In a lengthy ruling ordering Colorado's Secretary of State to exclude Mr. Trump from the state's Republican primary ballot, the justices reversed a Denver district court's finding last month that Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which disqualifies people who have engaged in insurrection against the Constitution after having taken an oath to support it from holding office, did not apply to the presidency. They affirmed the district court's other conclusions that Mr. Trump's actions before and on January 6, 2021 constituted engaging in insurrection, and that the courts had the authority to enforce Section 3 against a person whom Congress had not specifically designated. Mr. Trump is expected to appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. Tuesday's ruling applies only to Colorado, but if the Supreme Court were to affirm it, he could be disqualified more broadly. The Colorado Supreme Court stayed its ruling until January 4th, 2024, to allow for appeals. The Colorado Supreme Court is the first court to find that the disqualification clause applies to Mr. Trump, an argument his opponents have been making across the country. Similar lawsuits in Minnesota and New Hampshire were dismissed on procedural grounds. A judge in Michigan ruled last month that the issue was political and not for him to decide, and an appeals court affirmed the decision not to disqualify him. The plaintiffs there have appealed to the Michigan Supreme Court. The cases hinge on several questions. Was it an insurrection when Trump supporters stormed the Capitol on January 6, 2021, trying to stop the certification of the 2020 election? If so, did Mr. Trump engage in that insurrection through his messages to his supporters beforehand, his speech that morning, and his Twitter posts during the attack? Do courts have the authority to enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment without congressional action? And does Section 3 apply to the presidency? Judge Sarah B. Wallace, who made the district court ruling in Colorado, had said yes to all but the last question. Because Section 3 enumerates several offices, but not the presidency, and because the presidential oath is worded differently from the oaths of the unenumerated offices, Judge Wallace concluded that the broad phrase officers of the United States was not intended to include the presidency. The Colorado Supreme Court disagreed. Wow, okay. Well, that's big news, folks, and that's at least as significant a historical event as we could possibly review in the past. That was not an insurrection on January 6th. I mean, there have been so many more violent episodes, riots in the United States. Chicago 68 immediately comes to mind. The South Central LA riots of both the 1960s and after the Rodney King verdict in 1992. Now that's called the LA Uprising, and up to a point, I think that that's an appropriate name for the riots after Rodney King. LA Uprising was a major violent attack on authority, and wow. The events of January 6th were fundamentally silly. They looked silly. They were silly. There were a bunch of people taking selfies of themselves. There was no real violence on the part of the quote unquote insurrectionists. There was violence against them. I can't remember the name of the lady who was shot. She's not exactly a hero of mine. She was apparently in a sort of odd, extremely modern relationship called a throuple. We used to have couples, but if you've got three of them, it's a throuple. I don't know. But I can't remember her name. That's shameful on my part. But I just, I can't take January 6th seriously at all, and I'm appalled. I'm absolutely appalled that the Supreme Court of Colorado would take it seriously, call it an insurrection, and say that Donald Trump is disqualified from service as a consequence. And this is just, our country has lost its marbles, is one way of putting it. But but Sam Dixon's point is, did it ever have any marbles? Anyhow, that's I don't know what else I can say about that at this moment, because obviously it's just one state. Colorado was probably not going to go for Trump anyhow. I can't remember who it voted for in 2016 and 2020, but it is definitely a left-leaning state. It was among the first states to legalize recreational marijuana. I have heard some people say that the Hunger Games is basically predictive programming that the future capital of North America will be in Colorado. I don't know about that. All I know for sure is that Colorado has the most horrifying federal prison in existence, a supermax penitentiary built in the side of a mountain somewhere southeast of Denver. It's like something from science fiction. A prison built into the side of a mountain. It sounds like basically the recreation of hell. Now, we were talking about the state of Georgia passing the first state birth registration law exactly 200 years ago. 180 years ago, something that is more relevant to the time of year, 180 years ago, A Christmas Carol was published by Charles Dickens in London, and 6,000 copies were sold. I guess that's, to many people's mind, the quintessential Christmas story of greed, sin, and redemption. Several fabulous movies made out of it. When I was a kid, the Avatar was that was most common was came out in, I saw 71 or 72, something like that. Albert Finney's Scrooge, musical version of it. It's been running in my head recently. Sing a song of gladness and cheer, for the time of Christmas is here. Look around about you and see what a world of wonder this world can be. Sing a Christmas carol, sing a Christmas carol, sing a Christmas carol, like the children do, and enjoy the beauty, all the joy and beauty that a Merry Christmas can bring to you. Anyhow, that was Albert Finney's, and there were a lot of other good songs from that one, including Tiny Tim's on that beautiful Christmas morning, if my wish could come true somehow, then that beautiful day that I dream about would be here and now. Probably of all the movies, non-musical, I believe Alastair Sims' British version of the Christmas Carol would be considered the greatest. That's from the 1940s, 30s or 40s, I believe. But the concepts of Christmas, spirit of Christmas past, spirit of Christmas present, spirit of Christmas future, have been etched into the collective popular mind and consciousness. This is this is part of our Anglo-American heritage and culture, and of course, Dickens was a proto-socialist. He was in favor of labor reform and labor rights, as was almost everybody in Great Britain, if you think about it. Anyhow, moving along through our historical record, I have a note here that Allen Wilson of Connecticut in 1854 patented a sewing machine to sew curving seams. Hard to believe that all had to be done by hand before. Yeah, there were several in the 1860s. There were several battles of note on this day, and then let's see. Oh, in 1871, we've got Albert Jones of New York patenting corrugated paper. What would the world be without corrugated paper boxes? Could there be that? Now that's kind of like sewing curved seams. Can we imagine a world where sewing machines could not do curved seams like the shoulder of my shirt, for instance? That would have to be done by hand. Can we imagine a world where Amazon would not be able to ship by corrugated cardboard boxes? The transformations of technology in the 19th century by Europeans and Americans. Let's see, speaking of places other than Europe and America, in 1884, the Congo Free State, the personal property treated as basically the personal colony or personal property of Leopold II, the Congo Free State was recognized by Italy. And 4 years later, Henry Morton Stanley, a denizen of New Orleans, his house over in Coliseum Street, Coliseum Park, has a little plaque by there, home of Henry Morton Stanley, the one who arrived and said, "Dr. Livingston, I presume." He was born here in New Orleans, or grew up here in New Orleans anyhow. I'm not sure he was born here, but his house is over on Coliseum. And on this day in 1888, his expedition reached a place called Fort Bodo in East Africa. 1891, the first Negro Catholic priest ordained in the U.S., Charles Uncle, was ordained in Baltimore. That's a fairly significant moment in history, I guess. I don't know if there were. I assume that there were black priests who had been ordained in Africa before then. Also in 1891, Canada formed its first rugby unions. In 1900, General Horatio Kitchener offered protection to all Boers the Dutch of South Africa, who would surrender, and asked the Dutch community of Pretoria to convey his offer. Leaders in the field refused to surrender, and with disastrous consequences for the Dutch in South Africa. Moving right along through our list. In 1910, Baltimore was apparently a major place for racial conflict or racial developments anyhow, because first U.S. city ordinance requiring black and white residential areas was passed in Baltimore. That's really interesting. I would have thought it was long before that, but apparently 1910 was the beginning of de facto or de jure, I should say, racial segregation. I really would have thought it would have been much sooner than that, earlier than that. Also in 1910, rayon, first commercially produced at Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania. Just tell a little anecdote there. my ex-wife and I once had a really hilarious fight about she believed that rayon was a natural fiber, and I insisted that it was not a natural fiber, and I think that we ultimately went to the encyclopedia and resolved this. But ever since that date, I always joked around with her, you know, can you imagine how great it's going to be when, our grandfather leaves us his gigantic rayon plantation down in Brazil? Anyhow, you had to be there, I guess. The let's see what else we've got in the history date. In 1918, Robert Ripley began his Ripley's Believe It or Not column in the New York Globe. 1919, the American Meteorological Society was founded, and all of that's pretty boring. Oh, here's an exciting item. In 1922, Teresa Vaughan, 24, confesses in court in Sheffield, England, to having been married 61 times over 5 years in 50 cities in 3 countries. I suppose that probably made it into Ripley's Believe It or Not column, didn't it? Teresa Vaughan, age 24, confessed in court in Sheffield, England, to being married 61 times over 5 years in 50 cities in 3 countries. That's like a marathon race, isn't it? Wonder how she managed that. I've never heard that story, but I should read it. In any event, 1924, the last of the original Rolls-Royce Silver Ghosts was sold in England. The sort of the Model T of luxury cars, designed by Henry Royce. Some great stories coming out of the Rolls-Royce company. Also manufactured very fine aircraft engines. Let's see, what else do we have here? Oh, in 1932, on this date, the British Broadcasting Corporation begins transmitting overseas with the words, "This is the British, the BBC World Service." 1933, kind of related to that the 1823 event in Georgia, in terms of agglomeration of power to the government that used to be private. In 1933, President Franklin D. Roosevelt created the Electrical Home and Farm Authority, EHFA, to assist low-income households with the purchase of major appliances. How do you like that? 1939, the Winter War, the Soviets attacked Finnish positions near Suma, and that was, of course, at the beginning, close to the beginning of World War II. And on this day in 1941, Reichsfuhrer Adolf Hitler took complete personal command of the German army. That was probably a mistake. He was not. Well, I've said I mean, I admire many things that happened under National Socialism in Germany, but Hitler's conduct of the war was a total disaster, and basically doesn't matter what else we think of the Third Reich. Hitler's role as commander-in-chief was a total disaster. Let's see. What else do we have? Oh, on this day in 1945, speaking of Hitler, the Austrian Republic was reestablished. Fairly significant. 1946, the year after that, Ho Chi Minh launched his attack, the Viet Cong attack against the French in Hanoi. Hanoi, of course, is now capital of Vietnam, and Saigon, I believe, is called Ho Chi Minh City. (1948) was the eighth largest snowfall in New York City history, 15.3 inches. What else? Oh, yes, in 1950, we have the Dalai Lama of Tibet fleeing Lhasa for Yadong on the Tibetan-India border. He was the 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso. And also on the same day in 1950, General Dwight D. Eisenhower was named the commander of NATO. I think that we're approaching the end of major history on this day. I don't know whether 1960, Frank Sinatra's first session with Reprise Records counts as a major news event or not. Let's see. De Gaulle was reelected in 1965. Beatles' Seventh Christmas Fan Club single was released in '69. That must have been close to the end of them. Clockwork Orange. I remember this, actually. 1971, Clockwork Orange came out, much to the horror of cultural conservatives like my grandparents. They were simply scandalized by Stanley Kubrick and everything that he was doing. And also in movies, 1974 was The Man with the Golden Gun, the ninth James Bond film starring Roger Moore, Britt Ekland, and Christopher Lee, premiered in London. Oh, 1974, I remember this one too. Nelson Rockefeller was sworn in as Vice President of the United States. I had the opportunity to meet him on a couple of occasions through my late grandfather in New York City. I actually can say that I went to Sardi's restaurant in New York with the Vice President of the United States. I was a teenager. In any event, that is the history of the day, and the whole history is reflection on these life and law shaping events. And I guess of all the events that we've talked about, probably the most important from our perspective is what I just read from the New York Times in terms of what's going to happen next in the United States. The ruling in the Supreme Court of Colorado is going to have a lot of impact on the dialogue over the next year about whether the election of Joe Biden was legitimate, whether it was insurrection to protest the election of Joe Biden, as I did. I was not in Washington on January 6th, but I was on the team that put together a brief challenging the election of Joe Biden, led by Nathan McPherson of the state of Idaho. And we filed an amicus brief in support of the case of Texas versus, who was it? Texas versus the United States, I guess. No, Texas versus Pennsylvania, it was called. Texas versus Pennsylvania and Michigan. Texas was challenging the election. And that was really one of the Ken Paxton has turned out to be a really great attorney general in the state of Texas, and I supported him his completely. I think that he should have gone further. I think he should have raised the Republican form of government. One point on which I do fairly profoundly disagree with Sam Dixon is that I think we need to fight for the Constitution, even if it's heavily based on mythology, even if it's heavily twisted in modern times by the use of perverse language. I believe that the Constitution of the United States was, in fact, one of the greatest accomplishments of the human mind and one of the greatest visions of what law could be. And I guess that's a good place to stop today. And on a later date, I can tell you about how my doctoral dissertation on the Aztec and Maya of Mexico was actually connected to the U.S. Constitution and the analysis of tripartite government as a basic structure of human society. And with that, I think it's time to set sail on the ship known as the Flying Dutchman. This is Charles Lincoln, Captain Von der Decken, reporting to you from New Orleans. It is December 19th. In the next day or so, we will be celebrating the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year, and I guess looking forward to the days getting longer, although frankly I always dread the days getting longer because that means that we're headed back to another hot summer in New Orleans. Y'all have a great evening, December 19th. Think about whether January 6th was an insurrection and whether Donald Trump is an insurrectionist. If so, should we all support him because of that? Maybe so.